The Nazi regime became notorious for torturing and brutalizing Jews. But they were not the only group it persecuted. The National Socialist regime also targeted and brutalized others, particularly homosexuals. Stay until the end to discover the worst of what Adolf Hitler did to them. Homophobia at the time and the National Socialist movement's view. On January 30th, 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, marking the establishment of the Nazi regime. It began a long process of restricting the civil and human rights of people considered inferior or enemies of the state. During this period, the regime began establishing its notorious concentration camps. The first opened at Dachau. Its prisoners included not only political opponents and people of Jewish origin, but also many homosexual men. Most were arrested after being denounced by members of the public. Homosexuality was considered a crime at the time, and persecution intensified during the Third Reich. The Nazis arrested approximately 100,000 men for homosexuality, and around 53,000 were convicted. Some of those convicted were subsequently sent to concentration camps such as Dachau. The prisoners were subjected to brutal torture. Homosexual men were undoubtedly among the groups that suffered most at the hands of the Nazi regime. They were also subjected to medical experiments and sexual abuse. Homophobia and prejudice were pervasive at the time, and as a result, homosexual prisoners rarely received solidarity or support from other inmates. They were generally isolated and had no power within the prisoner hierarchy. During the Third Reich, between 5,000 and 15,000 men classified as homosexual offenders were held in concentration camps. Thousands of them died, while those who survived remained marked for the rest of their lives. Although same-sex relationships were illegal, gay communities grew substantially in Germany from the mid to late 19th century. These political and social conditions gave rise to campaigns for the decriminalization of same-sex relations, focused primarily on repealing Article 175, the legal provision used since 1871 to prosecute sexual relations between men. Before coming to power, Adolf Hitler, like other fascist leaders, vehemently criticized the artistic and scientific developments of the Weimar Republic between 1918 and 1933 after the First World War. They regarded this culture as decadent and degenerate. That view stemmed partly from their rejection of open, public expressions of sexuality, especially those associated with homosexuality. Some prominent Nazis, including Alfred Rosenberg and Heinrich Himmler, were extremely homophobic. Hitler and other leaders of the movement rarely addressed the subject. Their discussions focused instead on creating a greater German state, annihilating the Jewish people, and managing the economy. In legal policy, the Nazi Party opposed efforts to repeal Article 175. During parliamentary debates, the Nazis argued that homosexuality was a crime. They claimed that sexual relations between men arose from a destructive vice that would bring the German people to ruin. The party also denounced homosexuality as a behavioral aberration, in keeping with its belief that the Aryan population had to grow and that Germans should lead respectable family lives. The Nazis maintained that sexual relations were intended for reproduction, not pleasure. They therefore regarded homosexuality as a threat to the superiority of the Aryan race, and believed it should be punished even more severely than German law prescribed at the time. One of the major episodes of censorship and persecution targeting preserved materials in Germany took place on May 6, 1933, when SA stormtroopers raided the Institute for Sexual Science and seized the extensive holdings of its library. More than 12,000 books and 35,000 photographs were destroyed, along with numerous other works of art and literature deemed degenerate by the regime. Unfortunately, this material was never recovered. Lesbian women were persecuted too. Yet remarkably, lesbians were not systematically targeted under Nazi anti-homosexual policies. In the eyes of the Third Reich, they posed no threat to Nazi racial policy and were persecuted only if they were Jewish, Roma, or communist. Their arrests were generally not motivated by their sexuality. Despite the severe persecution of gay men in Germany, gay men in other territories were not targeted unless they had German partners. These sexual offenses could be pardoned only if the men became racially conscious and changed their way of life. That was the only way they could be accepted back into the racial community. Before we move on, I want to make sure you are still with us. Comment, "I want more stories." It only takes a moment, and it helps this video reach more people. Your comment may even be pinned, showing that you were here. Were there no homosexuals in the Third Reich? Despite all these attitudes, the fact is that some known homosexuals held prominent positions within the Nazi movement. One of the best known was Ernst Röhm, leader of the SA, a paramilitary organization affiliated with the Nazi Party. Its members were widely known as stormtroopers or brown shirts because of the color of their uniforms. Röhm described himself as a man attracted to the same sex. Yet he did not believe his sexuality conflicted with his political views or undermined his leadership of the SA. He believed that advocating the legalization of homosexuality was not about promoting tolerance or democratic rights, but about overturning the prevailing morality. He wrote that the moralism of some of his fellow Nazis did not strike him as revolutionary. The sexual orientation of SA leader Ernst Röhm was known within the party's inner circle, but it became a public scandal in 1931 when a left-wing newspaper revealed that he was gay. Despite the backlash and controversy, Hitler defended his loyal friend and aide, allowing Röhm to remain head of the SA until 1934. That year, Hitler came under pressure from senior German army leaders, whose support he needed to become president. He ordered the SS to kill Röhm and 300 other SA members, some of whom were also homosexual. After the killings, the Nazi leadership's condemnation of and intolerance toward homosexuality and gay communities intensified further. Hitler's measures against homosexuals. After coming to power on January 30, 1933, the Nazis set out to destroy the homosexual culture and communities that had developed during the Weimar Republic. One of their first measures against these communities was to close gay bars and meeting places across Germany. Despite the new restrictions, some establishments continued to operate in cities such as Berlin and Hamburg. Many clandestine venues survived until the mid-1930s, but increased police surveillance of sexual activity and further Nazi closures made it far more difficult for people to pursue same-sex relationships freely. Newspapers played a crucial role, allowing members of the gay community to communicate with one another through their pages. Over time, the Nazis also persecuted, censored, and eliminated newspapers, magazines, and editorials associated in any way with gay life. As might be expected, homosexual associations were also shut down and targeted by the Nazi Party. The persecution certainly did not end there. From 1933 into early 1934, the Nazis relied heavily on legislation and police measures to detain homosexual men without trial. This was part of a Third Reich campaign to combat and reduce what it considered criminal conduct. The authorities also arrested people for public indecency, sexual relations with minors, and incest. A large proportion of those detained under the campaign were homosexual men, and some were interned in the first Nazi concentration camps. The Third Reich's judicial system also recognized public castration as a legal practice. From late 1933, courts could order castration as punishment for certain sexual offenders. Even so, men previously imprisoned under Article 175 could not be castrated without their supposed consent. They could, however, secure early release by agreeing to the procedure. One man subjected to these conditions was Friedrich Paul von Großheim. He was among 230 homosexual men arrested by the SS in January 1937. He spent 10 months confined in an unheated cell with little food and no access to a toilet. In 1938, he was arrested and tortured again. He was released only on condition that he be castrated. He agreed and underwent the operation. In 1943, he was arrested for a third time. On this occasion, Paul was sent to Neuengamme concentration camp as a political prisoner. He survived the war and died in Hamburg, Germany in 2006 at the age of 99. The pink lists and the beginning of more systematic persecution. In the autumn of 1934, Heinrich Himmler ordered police in every major German city to compile lists of known homosexuals. These records became publicly known as the pink lists, although neither the Nazis nor the police officially used that name. In late 1934, the Gestapo, the regime's official political police, carried out a series of raids on gay bars, detaining many homosexuals. Most had no involvement in the political scene at the time. Many of those detained in the raids and accused of homosexuality maintained that the acts they had committed were not punishable under Article 175. They therefore expected to be released soon. Instead, they were mistreated and sent to the concentration camps at Dachau and Lichtenberg. These measures marked the beginning of the Nazi campaign against the gay community, which developed into systematic persecution of these groups. The event that set this process in motion was the murder of Röhm and other prominent SA figures in June and July of 1934. These killings marked a shift in Nazi propaganda against homosexuality. Hitler personally gave the order amid a power struggle at the highest levels of the German government and the National Socialist Party. Nazi propaganda used Röhm's sexuality to justify the murders, exploiting the prejudices then widespread among Germans against same-sex relationships. The second phase of these measures took effect in June 1935, when the Nazi leadership revised Article 175 of the German Penal Code, the provision used to prosecute sexual relations between men. The revised statute criminalized a broad range of sexual and intimate acts and behaviors. It stipulated that non-consensual and coercive acts between men could carry a sentence of up to 10 years of penal servitude. This change effectively gave the Third Reich free rein to arrest and prosecute as many people as possible. In 1936, Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS and German police, created the Reich Central Office for donating homosexuality and abortion. The office formed part of the Kripo, the criminal police, which collaborated with the Gestapo. Himmler saw homosexuality and abortion as threats to Germany's birth rate and, consequently, to the future of the German people. The persecution campaign intensified further. Between 1935 and 1936, the system for persecuting homosexuals expanded, with the government focusing particularly on arresting men under Article 175. The authorities maintained that these individuals should be treated as homosexual offenders, criminals, and enemies of the state. Himmler remained convinced that persecuting these men was necessary to strengthen the German population and ensure its continued growth. He ordered the Kripo and the Gestapo to carry out an even broader campaign against homosexuality. These forces therefore stepped up police raids using brutal interrogation methods, in other words, torture, to identify and detain anyone who violated Article 175. From the mid to late 1930s, police raided bars and other gathering places considered popular with homosexuals. The authorities set up police cordons around these establishments, then questioned anyone they deemed suspicious. Some of the men were released when police found insufficient evidence against them, but anyone found guilty of violating Article 175 was sent directly to a concentration camp. These actions had major repercussions for the Nazi campaign against Germany's homosexual community. Their impact, however, came not from the effectiveness of the raids themselves, but from intimidation and the climate of fear they created within these communities. The main way of identifying men who violated Article 175 was through denunciations and tips from others. Informants were usually neighbors, colleagues, and even family members who reported their suspicions to the police. At the time, many Germans supported this policy of persecuting homosexuals. They described those they denounced as effeminate, unmanly, and perverse. Denunciations proved far more effective than police raids as a tool of Nazi repression, leading to the arrest and conviction of tens of thousands of people. The Gestapo and Kripo were responsible for interrogating those detained in raids or following denunciations. They subjected prisoners to psychological and physical torture until they obtained a full confession. During interrogation, the victims were also forced to reveal the names of their sexual partners, giving the Nazis more people to question and convict. In this way, entire networks of homosexual men across Germany were rounded up. These groups were treated differently and did not all respond to Nazi persecution in the same way. They did not all make the same choices and, of course, did not all have the same options. Homosexuals whom the regime classified as Aryan, for example, had far more options than Jews and Roma, who were also persecuted on the racial grounds invoked by the Third Reich. Some homosexuals with greater financial resources found ways to conceal their sexuality. Some cut ties with their friends and withdrew from public life. Many moved to another city, to the countryside, or even to another country. Others married women purely for convenience. In this way, they escaped persecution. Despite all the dangers, some groups chose to fight the Nazi regime, whether for political or personal reasons. Some resisted. Some gay people helped hide Jews, while others joined underground resistance groups fighting the Nazis. One prominent example was Willem Arondeus, a gay member of the Dutch resistance who took part in the attack on Amsterdam's population registry offices on March 27, 1943, during the German occupation of the Netherlands. Willem's group succeeded in destroying 800,000 identity documents belonging to Jews and others wanted by the Nazis. These represented 15% of all registrations. Soon afterward, he was betrayed and arrested on April 1, 1943. Willem pleaded guilty and accepted all the charges connected with the attack before he was executed. He made sure the public knew that he and 2 other men in his group were homosexual. His message was, "Tell the people that homosexuals can be courageous." He was executed on July 1, 1943, at the age of 48. Not everyone was equally fortunate, nor did all of the roughly 100,000 men detained by the regime under Article 175 share the same fate. After an arrest, detainees normally stood trial before a court, which decided whether they would be acquitted or convicted, and, if convicted, how long they would spend in prison. About half of these cases ended in conviction. Most of those convicted were released after serving their sentences. In rare cases, however, the Gestapo or the Kripo sent a man to a concentration camp as a homosexual offender. This generally happened when a man had several similar convictions or other factors were considered aggravating. Taking these factors into account, an estimated 5,000 to 15,000 people were sent to concentration camps because of their sexuality. Homosexual prisoners were generally forced to wear camp uniforms marked with a pink triangle, sewn on so that SS guards could easily identify their alleged crimes. The badge tended to attract particular attention because they were treated as a group apart from the others. Many accounts describe homosexual prisoners as among those who suffered most in the camps. Guards often murdered them out of sheer cruelty during sadistic games. Evidence suggests that SS guards used the pink triangles on prisoners' chests as targets for shooting practice. By mid-1942, nearly all of Sachsenhausen's 200 homosexual prisoners had been executed. They were often assigned the most difficult and demanding jobs in the entire camp labor system. At other camps, including Mauthausen and Flossenburg, homosexual prisoners were routinely worked to death. Their deaths were later classified as natural. Conditions only grew worse, and abuse was constant. Alongside the violence, many homosexual prisoners were sexually assaulted in the camps. Those who wore the pink triangle suffered abuse at the hands of both guards and fellow inmates. At Buchenwald, for example, the Nazis subjected them to medical experiments. These ranged from typhus trials to bizarre attempts to alter their sexual orientation by implanting organs intended to increase testosterone production. Most of those subjected to these abusive experiments died. They were also forced to take Pervitin so its effects could be tested before it was distributed to German soldiers. At Sachsenhausen, they were subjected to experimental treatments for phosphorus burns. From November 1942, concentration camp commandants were given the power to order the castration of prisoners identified by the pink triangle. This last measure had a profound impact on them, because the other prisoners became afraid of being seen with homosexual men and of being subjected to the same experiments and abuses. In addition to all these cruelties, the homosexual prisoners suffered from a lack of solidarity from the other inmates, especially when smaller quantities of food and clothing were distributed. Joseph Kohut is one example of a homosexual man who was imprisoned at the age of 24 after violating the notorious Article 175. The authorities arrested him after discovering a Christmas card he had sent to his boyfriend. After the war, Joseph recalled how Sachsenhausen operated. There, gay men had almost no rights or respect. They were forbidden to speak with prisoners from other blocks or with inmates belonging to other prisoner categories, because the authorities believed they would try to seduce these other men and harm them as a result. Each of these blocks housed 250 men per wing, all imprisoned for violating the same article. At night, it was extremely cold, and it was common for ice several centimeters thick to form on the windows of the dormitories. Gay prisoners were always forced to sleep in a nightshirt that offered little protection from the cold, and they also had to keep their hands outside their blankets. The Nazis' diseased minds believed these measures would prevent masturbation. The prisoners also had to remain about 5 meters from the other blocks. Anyone caught violating this rule was flogged by the guards, receiving at least 15 or 20 lashes for the crime. If guards found a prisoner from one of these wings without his underwear on or with his hands under the covers, they would soak his hands and force him to stand outside in the extreme cold. Very few survived this punishment. Joseph Kohut survived the war. In 1946, he met the man who would become his lifelong companion, and they remained together until Joseph's death in 1994. In the concentration camps, some prisoners used their fluency in German to secure less punishing work, such as administrative posts. Younger, more attractive men could also gain certain advantages through sexual relationships with SS guards, although their isolation often made survival far more difficult. Many homosexual men were imprisoned for reasons unrelated to their sexual orientation. Some were sent to the camps as political opponents or because they were Jewish. In those cases, they were generally assigned a different badge from the one described earlier. It is estimated that between 3,100 and 3,600 prisoners who wore the pink triangle died. The Second World War begins. Officially, it began on the 1st of September 1939. Although men continued to be arrested throughout the war, the demands of the conflict pushed the campaign against homosexuals into the background. Many of those convicted under Article 175 even enlisted in the German armed forces. The military needed manpower and considered a soldier's sexuality less important under the circumstances. Hébert Becker was one such case. A German designer, actor, and photographer, he had been imprisoned by the Nazi regime because of his sexual orientation. Needing more recruits, the German army released him to fight on the Eastern Front, where he remained until 1944. Hébert survived the war and died in Hamburg in 2002 at the age of 95. At the end of the war, the Nazis destroyed many archives, including the records of the Reich's Central Office for Combating Homosexuality and Abortion. Experts estimate that the Nazi regime made at least 100,000 arrests under Article 175. More than 53,000 of those arrested were convicted. Liberation and the post-war era. In the spring of 1945, Allied soldiers liberated the concentration camps and their prisoners, including those who wore the pink triangle. Yet the end of the Second World War and the fall of the Third Reich did not necessarily bring homosexuals complete freedom. They remained marginalized in German society, while sexual relations between men continued to be illegal in Germany for much of the 20th century. Many men serving sentences for alleged violations of Article 175 remained in prison even after the war. Tens of thousands of people were convicted during the post-war period. Homosexuality was not decriminalized in East Germany until 1968, and in West Germany until 1969. It was only in the 1990s that the German government recognized these people as victims of the Nazi regime. In 2002, the government overturned convictions under Article 175. For the first time, homosexuals who had suffered so much at the hands of the Nazis became entitled to financial compensation from Germany for the injustices committed against them. Because of persistent prejudice against their sexual orientation, and because Article 175 remained in force for much of the 20th century, many homosexuals were afraid to share their testimony or even write their own memoirs. It is utterly absurd to think that people were persecuted simply because they belonged to a particular ethnic group or because of their sexual orientation. Unfortunately, this still happens today. That is why we must never forget these events. The memory of the men and women who suffered at the hands of that bloodthirsty, brutal regime must be honored. We must continue fighting to ensure that it never happens again. And with that, we come to the end of today's video. Don't forget to show your support by clicking the like button and subscribing below. It helps us know that we're on the right track. Until next time, now enjoy the video appearing on your recommended screen.